In a relationship, when is honesty not the best policy? How do you balance what you want versus what you need? And is there something you need to say to your spouse but can't find the right way to say it? If so, then you're in the right place. This is the Lunch with Sandy podcast. With nearly 20 years of marriage under their belts, Terrence and Sandy Jackson discuss a range of topics, provide valuable insights on relationships, and talk about the conversations married couples need to have. So what does lunch have to do with all of this? Well, it's a metaphor for how these conversations originally started. Speaking of conversations, let's get one going. Here's your hosts, Terrence and Sandy.
Welcome to the Lunch with Sandy podcast, where we discuss different topics and have conversations that married couples need to have. I'm Terrence.
And I'm Sandy.
And today we're going to be having a discussion about something that I deemed overrated a couple episodes back. But before we get into that, let's get these formalities out of the way and get to what everyone wants to hear about. And that is, how are you doing today, Sandy?
Everybody's dying.
Everyone's on their edge of their seat.
I know.
Waiting for your response. They're waiting for that one-word response.
Tired.
Yeah, there it is. Ding, 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 ding. There it is.
I have an excuse this time. It was a very busy weekend, traveling out of state, coming home. It was a lot of hours in the car driving.
I want you to realize that what you said was you have an excuse, not a reason, and that's it. She has an excuse, not a reason.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that you enjoyed the trip.
It was good. Haven't seen the family in a couple of years due to COVID issues, but so it was nice to just see everybody.
I'm glad you were able to see everyone. I, unlike you,
we're stuck home.
I wasn't stuck home. I was home with our wonderful dog, Jax. And Jax, in true fashion, pretended like I wasn't here. It's very strange with Jax because when he's with you, for a while, he'll be fine. But then it's like you're not there.
Yeah.
But then if you leave for 2 seconds and you come back, it's like he hasn't seen you in a million years.
Yeah. Well, so true. Because when I work from home, he's home with me all day long. And half the time, he doesn't even spend any time with me.
Yeah.
But then you come home from work, you take him out for a walk, and then he gets home and it's like he hasn't seen me in days.
Yeah.
I'm like, you've been home with me all day long.
That's just the life that he lives.
Right.
All right. This week, we got to shine the light on somebody.
Okay.
And for half a second, I didn't know who I was going to shine the light on.
Oh.
But then I remembered the conversation that I was having yesterday with my man, Anthony. And I got to shine the light on Awoken Apparel. No, not you. Awoken Apparel, which is it's a company that's owned by Anthony L. Sanders. You know, I'm going to shine the light on a couple of people because you know what? The fellas got together this weekend. Mm-hmm. And we got together. We got to see Tim from New York. Tim came down. Court was there. Obviously, myself and Anthony was there. Dave couldn't make it and Scott wasn't there. But I was representing Awoken Apparel when I went up into the restaurant that we went to. Nice. And I had I had a nice long conversation with Anthony yesterday. And so shout out to Awoken Apparel, the stuff that he's doing with the Rhode Island Fashion Show that's coming up and all that other good stuff. So shout out to him. Now.
Yeah.
That
didn't come on as good as I wanted it.
Yeah. Leave those alone. We've been married for over 20 years.
I was going to say, did you forget?
No, I didn't forget.
Pause there for a minute.
Listen, it was a dramatic pause. You got to learn to read the room. It was a dramatic pause.
Yes.
We're going to do a whole episode on reading the room with you eventually at some point because we got to teach you how to read. Anyway, we've been married for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And I'd say for the most part, we're pretty happy.
Just for the most
part. Listen, you know, we got a beautiful family. Mm-hmm. You know, I think we have a great perspective on where we are and where we're trying to go. But I would argue that, and this is where we go back a couple episodes, I would argue that the possibility exists that even if we had not gotten married, mm-hmm. we might probably still be in the same place that we're in right now. And when I say that, what I mean is, so the choice to get married is a personal choice.
Yep.
And I'm speaking from my perspective. I want to make sure I make that clear. It's a personal choice, and I think that personal choice is different based on each individual. But we've been able to stand the test of time when I talk about 20 years, and not every marriage actually works out that way.
Yeah, correct.
So understanding that not every marriage can last as long as ours have, I want to pose this question that we're going to try to answer. And again, when we ask these questions, we do answer them, but it's really about trying to understand or get insight or give insight into what some other people might be thinking. And apparently Jax has some insight into that, in case you didn't hear that. But
he said, no, not this topic again.
Yeah. Jax, just the term is beating a dead horse, not a dead dog. Anyway, why do you think it is that people get married?
I think probably the biggest reason is expectation.
Really?
Yeah.
I would say that the biggest, I want to get back to that for a second, but I would think that I would have bet money that your answer for the biggest reason would have been love.
Well, I think people decide to stay committed because of love. I don't think that's necessarily, well, obviously you can play both sides at that comment too. But I think the biggest reason that people get married today is because expectations. That's what's expected of people, is to get married, whether it's socially, whether it's your family's expectation, whether it's your religious expectation, just following the norm. I feel like that is, to me, I think the biggest reason.
Yeah. So I hear what you're saying. I'm still going to go on that love thing, but okay. So I think commitment in a relationship, not commitment in companionship is a big reason that people get married. But I want to touch on something that you said. You said the expectation. I challenge that from this perspective. And when I say I challenge that, what I mean is, as time goes on, things get different. And I think we're living in a different environment.
Absolutely.
The question that I would like to ask you and then try to answer is, before, and I'm going to try not to go too far off topic, is that really still the expectation as some of the older generation starts to move in a different direction, right?
Yeah.
I think now that with the change in how people view things now with the younger generation coming up, I don't know if it's so much of an expectation anymore. And I could be wrong. I know that in the past, there was that expectation where, you go to school, you go to college, get out of college, you have 2.5 kids, and you get married.
Right. Well, get married, then have the 2.5 kids, but.
Tomato. We're from different places. Sometimes you end up having those 2.5 kids and you got to get married.
Yeah.
Expectation.
Right. I think while we don't have as many family and religious expectations anymore, I still feel like it's considered the norm. Do you know what I mean? To get married. Like, people are just expected to get married.
I think it can be considered the norm depending on the culture and the environment that you're in. And that's important because in a lot of places, it's not considered the norm. And when I say that, I speak from, again, we're from different places. There's a lot of people who, growing up, they were together forever, never got married.
Yeah. It
wasn't the expectation. The expectation was, okay, well, we're committed. We're going to be committed. And this is why I say, or this is why I have said that in some cases, I do think that the concept behind it, not really the concept. Let's rephrase that. The extra stuff around it can be overrated because, again, if you decide to commit to somebody, it shouldn't take you standing in front of someone saying, I do, to make sure you stick to that actual commitment. So I do think in some cases it's the norm. I do think in some cases it's expected, but in other cases.
So let me ask you a question then. I feel like definitely different cultures, right, still have a lot of those parental and religious expectations. I feel like maybe here in the U.S. we don't have that as much anymore. Do you also think that maybe it's a socioeconomic expectation then? Like you said, we grew up in different...
I think economic plays a part in it. And by that, what I mean is when you start looking at, let's look at the marriage as an investment, right? Mm-hmm. So when you form a partnership, there's some stability that can come with that.
Yeah.
Right? There's financial stability. There can be stability from a mental health perspective. And when I say mental health, what I mean by that is when you have someone to share the burden with, and I don't want to say burden, but I'm using that for lack of a better term. When you have someone to share those challenges that you might come up with, or to share those experiences that you might go through, mm-hmm. It's easier when you're not by yourself.
Yeah.
So I do think from a particular, when you look at that perspective from a socioeconomic perspective, I do think that can play a role, because if financial stability is not on your radar,
right,
then it's not going to be one of the reasons. And then the other part about that too is if I look at it from a different angle, in some cultures, let me take the word culture out of it. And some, I'm trying to find the exact word. I'll use environments, or we're going to say environments. In some environments, there's not that extra funding, mm-hmm. for lack of a better term, to actually go through that whole process of marriage.
Yeah. Well, and when we're talking about expectations, well, what's the expectation of marriage? Is it just you go in front of, go down to town hall? Is there a party that's expected? Like, there could also be that financial implication of it. Like, I don't have the time or the energy or the money to bother spending on a marriage.
Well, I think, yeah.
Like having, like, not a marriage, but having the marital ceremony, I guess.
You can call it a wedding, or just a ceremony.
But I mean, if you go to the Justice of the Peace, is it really a wedding? Like,
well,
I
it's
don't
still
know.
a ceremony. It's a ceremony,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. So, like, people might decide that, right?
Well,
like,
yeah, and
the expectation is I have a party. I don't want to have a party, so I'm not going to get married.
Yeah, expectations differ based on what your background is, what you believe culturally, what you believe religiously, right? Mm-hmm. So, some people get married to start a family. Again, as I said earlier, some people start a family and then have to get married, right? But you don't necessarily have to be married to actually start a family. But again, from a religious perspective and from some cultural perspectives, that's an expectation, is to start a family. And, prior to starting that family, mm-hmm. you have to get married. So that's one of those things or one of the reasons why I believe people might get married, or some people do get married for. Now, here's another angle of it. And I thought you were going to go here when you said the U.S. There's the whole aspect of arranged marriages.
Yeah.
And I don't know a lot about them.
Yeah, me neither. I don't know if they happen very often on this country anymore. But
well, I don't know whether or not they happen this often in this country, but in other cultures, they still happen.
Definitely.
And a lot. And so, it could be a situation where, your family might have immigrated from another country, or you may have the majority of your family in that other country, and there's still that's the
true.
Aspect of arranged marriage. And I remember this is going back to probably, this was after COVID. Our office was working with a particular vendor, and a bunch of us went out, and I can't remember the young lady's name, but she was doing data mapping for this company. And she lived here. Her fiance lived in, I want to say, Delaware somewhere.
Okay.
But they were going back to India to get married. And she hadn't she met him like once or twice. It was an arranged marriage. Mm-hmm. So, and the part of that is, again, I think I can't go into too much of what the purpose of an arranged marriage is, but I would guess that some of these things fall into the reason, the same reason as, a typical marriage, financial stability or starting a family and building that partnership.
Right. This family seems like a good family, so you're going to marry into it, and combine our families.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we talked about some of the reasons why people might get married. But here's the thing, and I think this is different based on who you ask. Mm-hmm. What does marriage mean?
Mm-hmm. So, marriage to me, what it means is a commitment to each other that you have to keep committing to.
A commitment to each other that you have to keep committing to.
I don't know a better terminology for this off the top of my head, but I feel like to stay married is a daily commitment.
Yeah.
Maybe not daily, maybe monthly or weekly. But you know what I mean? Like, it's something that you're constantly renewing. And I'm not talking about a ceremony let's renew our vows. I'm talking about just committing to the marriage, committing to this partnership.
Yeah. So each person will answer that differently, yes, right? Definitely. It's different based on each individual. And I do think that it's a process, mm-hmm. right? It's not, a destination. It's a situation where you have to continue to put the work in and continue to invest in. But I would also say that should be typical of any commitment.
Yes.
I do think that when you talk about being married, there is a portion of that where you have to let go of some of yourself. Mm-hmm. You have to be selfless in a lot of situations. But again, I can say the same thing about any committed relationship.
Yes.
And this is why terms sometimes blur the lines between what something is and what something isn't. Mm-hmm. Because we're sitting here talking about marriage, but marriage is a commitment.
Yeah.
Now, is a commitment marriage? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So when I start talking about some of these things, and when I start talking about them being overrated, I want to make sure that people understand that I'm not saying that you shouldn't go out and get married.
Right.
What I'm saying is we tend to put labels on things, and the label becomes much more mm-hmm. than what the actual meaning should be.
You're right. People can be married and it only lasts a couple of years. And then you can have people who are not married and their commitment in their relationship lasts 30 years.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is because you take that word and you say, I'm married now. I've done it.
Right.
But are you putting in the work? How committed are you to actually committing every day, like you said?
Right. Well, and like you said, marriage means something different to everybody. And so what does marriage mean to you?
Yeah.
Does that mean I'm just going to have somebody to come home to and then I can continue being selfish and doing what I want to do? There's so many different, and I would hope that that's not the case, but there's just so many different interpretations of what.
I go back to, this is one of, so the first 2 seasons of this podcast, we talked a lot about foundations and all those mm-hmm. things. And there's a progression to where we're going and what we're doing. But I go back to, for me, marriage is growing and changing with and for each other. Mm-hmm. And it's a constant thing.
Yes.
And it's not always a situation that's going to be smooth. It's not going to be a situation where it's always going to be, roses and all that other sweet stuff, right? It's a process of working through whatever comes at you and being able to get through it. And I think that when you look at it from that perspective, you understand that it's not about the word, it's about the work.
Yeah.
You like that. It's not about the word. I got to write that down. It's not about the word.
Yeah. No.
It's about the work.
Agreed. Like, I don't know. Like, to your point, you can have commitment without marriage. You can have marriage without a commitment. But to me, for me, the reason for marriage would be, right, like, hey, we are partners now, and we are striving towards either like common goals, like we're here to support each other, it's no longer, two individuals. We're one now.
And that one unit is building a secure and stable environment, not just for themselves, but for any other family that may come along with that. And I think that when you talk about the meaning of marriage, regardless of who it is who has to define it, some of those pieces have to be a part of the definition if you're going to actually be able to weather whatever storm that may come. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, I've said this probably 3 times now, but I'm going to say it again. I think that people get caught up in the word. People get caught up in the idea. Yeah. And the idea in the word is not the work.
Right.
Everything that you do requires work.
I do feel like some people do think marriage is like almost like an end state.
Oh, yeah. But listen, so again, you talk about that expectation. you know.
Check.
Exactly.
Mark that off my bucket list.
So Anthony said something to me yesterday, and it had to do with, it was more on the parenting side, but it applies to marriage as well. And he said, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, but basically he said, there's no book to this. Yeah. No one's written a book on any of this stuff. So you go out and you do the best that you can. And I think the challenge for some people is there's no book. And when you go out to do the best you can, it requires work.
Right.
And sometimes is the juice worth the squeeze, so to say. Is the amount of work necessary that you have to put in worth it to the individual? And I think in some cases where marriages fail, they deem that work is not actually worth putting in the effort.
Right.
Now, I can't say that for certain, right? Because I'm still in a marriage.
Last time we checked. But no, like, do people feel that once you're married, it's like, okay, now I don't have to put my best foot forward. Like, I can just be myself. I can let myself go. Like, there's no effort that is needed now to continue, because I got my spouse. They're going to love me for however I look,
I love how you throw things in there like, well, I could just let myself go. I hear what you're saying.
Well,
and I do think
at one point say, why, when you started running and biking and doing all this crazy stuff, and I said, what new expectation are you setting for us? I thought we were just going to grow old and fat together.
I never said I was growing old and fat. Listen, that might have been you on one of those days where you say you run to eat cake, but I never said I was going to grow old and fat. Listen, I done told you, I'm vintage. I got to keep this car in vintage shape. That means running and purring like a kitten. So the definition will be different based on each individual. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask this question. And again, I don't want people to think that I'm attacking marriage. What I am doing is I'm asking questions now because I'm looking at this through the lens of multiple different individuals from different perspectives. Does the concept of marriage still matter? And I guess maybe I shouldn't say the concept. Well, I guess I have to say the concept.
Yeah.
Because when I say concept, there are aspects of everything that's beautiful, right? But I'm looking at the totality of what's been, for lack of a better term, defined as marriage and the experiences that I've seen people have with it.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a rhetorical question, though. Let me answer your question with a question, I should say.
Yep.
Do you think people may work a little harder to keep a marriage together than somebody who is not married and they've just been in a very long-term relationship?
I think the work is work. I think that the idea of marriage for some people, that being an idea that they have to actually decide whether or not they want to actually put the work in. Whereas if you're committed to someone and you've been committed to them, you didn't have to have a ceremony. And so I think there's a layer that just is cast to the side because that commitment is there. If that commitment's not there, and I'm not saying that if you're in a committed relationship and you're not technically married, that it's, all sugar and spice. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, I don't know if I can answer that because of the fact that each person is different. The way that people react is different. And when you talk about being in a marriage, I think what happens is because of that ceremony, there's all these things that you have to consider before you can end it.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're in a committed relationship, I don't think that any of those I don't want to say any of those worries. I think it's different because you're not fighting to uphold that idea. I think sometimes you're trying to uphold an idea and that causes more problems than if you were just in a relationship and you had troubles and you tried working through them.
Right. So, yeah. So for me, marriage has a major religious component to it. But I also acknowledge that there's a lot of people out there that can't get married, that whatever state they live in, whatever it is, they just don't have country.
You open up a can of worms there.
They're not allowed to get married, right? So does that make their commitment any less or more? No, I think it is a personal decision, right? But it also kind of makes me wonder with the fact that divorces can be expensive. There's a lot of legal paperwork and all that other stuff in there. Does it tend to bind people? I wouldn't say, do they stay together purposely because they don't want to go through it? But I'm wondering if it binds them maybe together a little longer. I don't know. Like, I just don't want to bother going through all this paperwork. So let's just stay married. But that doesn't mean that we're in a committed relationship anymore together. Do you know what I mean? Like, until there's a reason to nullify it.
Well, you're past nullifying.
For lack of a better word. So let's just stay married. And if we ever find somebody and it becomes an issue, then we'll deal with it.
Yeah. I think the one thing that we didn't cover is what the original point was to marriage to begin with. And I had done a little bit of research on it, and I'm not going to really get into all that. But I do want to touch on, that aspect of the challenge for the concept of marriage to me sometimes, gets a little murky and based off something that you said. There are people who, for a long time, and in some places, cannot get married.
Correct.
And that doesn't make their commitment any less.
Right.
So from my perspective, I look at their commitment and say, okay, well, I value their commitment to each other much more than a marriage. Because again, when we start talking about the totality and we start talking about what does marriage mean and why people get married, there's an ugliness that gets attached to it when you say to someone you can't marry because of who you are.
Yep. And
that's where I have to look at it from a different perspective and look at it through a different lens and say, I think that sometimes the concept can be overrated. Not to take away from any individual, because there are some people who may not be able to get married and really want to get married. No one wants to be denied something that they rightfully should have access to.
Right.
But in my eyes, then I start to say, you know what? I much rather value my commitment that I make to someone because no one else can tell me how committed I am to someone. No one can say, okay, well, now that you stood before me, this makes you legitimate or not legitimate.
Right. And I think basically we just boiled it down. I feel like the concept of marriage, more or less, it was probably derived more in a legal sense and a religious sense. But I feel like that's even starting to not be as prevalent anymore.
Well, I don't know about the legal sense. I think the legal sense is because when you got to split legally.
Well, yeah, but I'm just thinking from the perspective of medical insurance. You couldn't
yeah. I think all of that is
who weren't married on the same plan, right? So you both had to pay the more expensive. Now it's okay, well, if you go habitate, that you can put each other and things of that nature. So, I don't know. I feel like some of those. That's what I mean about the legality of it. I think some of that is even starting to dissolve a little bit.
Yeah. In any event, we've gone through all of that just to talk about what it means and what it doesn't mean and why people get married and why people don't get married. And so we're going to get down to the realization of the week because we can go on and have this conversation.
Well, and everybody can have a different perspective too. You could have many of our listeners could think completely different from what we're saying.
Well, yes, because it's pretty clear there are many reasons why people get married, and I think that the reasons are personal.
Yep.
And I think at the same time, I think the meaning is sometimes personal too, and trying to sit and define that for everyone. We just wouldn't be able to do. So we're going to leave it at that, and we're going to bring that conversation to the close. However, I got to get to my realization of the week. And someone had asked me a question a couple of weeks ago, and they said, well, why are you able to do A, B, and C? And so the reason why I'm able to do that really came into play this week. My realization for this week, and everyone should probably learn to do this, you have to learn to be comfortable with who you are wherever you are. And what I mean by that is you shouldn't have to change who you are for anybody. You shouldn't have to change who you are regardless of where you are. When you learn to be comfortable with who you are and where you are, there's so many different things that will be easier, and I don't know if easier is the correct term, but you'll have an easier time and have to deal with less.
Confident?
Well, confident and when you're able to be who you are wherever you are truly being yourself, which makes things a bit easier.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think we all need to learn, to be who you are, wherever you are, whenever you are. Thanks for listening. Until next conversation, take care.
That's it for this week's episode of the Lunch with Sandy podcast. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your feedback and comments on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Lunch with Sandy. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate and review us. Thanks again for listening to the Lunch with Sandy podcast.